Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on India's national television channel Doordarshan about India's foreign policy, India's international relations, and important developments in different corners of the world that are linked to India's rise as a major player in the world. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking a close look at the most happening and potentially fastest growing continent on the planet, Africa. We're going to look at why Africa is advancing fast on so many fronts. What are Africa's challenges as it rises and tries to claim the African century? And what can India do to enable Africa's rise as it aspires to take its due place under the sun? To discuss this, let me introduce you to a very specialized panel that I have today with me in the studio. Two experts on Africa from the African continent itself. I have with me Professor Rita Lorbo. She's a sociologist and teaches at the Jindal School of International Affairs and focuses on armed conflicts and humanitarian issues in the African continent. Professor Lorbo, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you for having me.
I also have with me Professor Chisom Ubabukoh. He is a trained economist from Nigeria and also teaches at the Jindal Global Law School here in India. Professor Ubabukoh looks closely at the African economic miracle and its prospects. So welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me start with Professor Ubabukoh. Coming from Africa, from one of the most important countries, the most populous country of Africa, Nigeria, please tell our audiences why Africa has been projected as the next big thing in the global development scene, in the global economy, and we have been seeing the projections that Africa is rebounding fast from the depths of the global pandemic, the coronavirus crisis that happened a few years ago, and the continental growth for the coming half decade or long is projected to be much higher than other continents, other regions of the world. It's looking quite optimistic if you look at the big picture. We'll of course also look at Africa's problems, but to start with, why does Africa have this bounce? And what is it about Africa's people, its demography and its sectoral dynamics, you think, which make it such a promising place for the world to look up to as the engine and the motor for global growth and for development going into the future?
Yes, thank you. That's a very important question. Africa, for a very long time, has been seen as the dark continent, has been seen as the place where nothing good happens. But in recent years, Africa is emerging as one of the strongest global powers, the regions. Among the countries that are growing fastest, they are the top 20, I think 11 of them are African countries. So you have countries like Senegal, Libya, Ethiopia, Niger, who are doing very well. They are, countries are going beyond, what people would expect. The continent has a very young population in terms of the demography. So
the median age is 19.
Yes, yes, something like that. So there's a lot of potential for growth. There's a lot of potential. The resilience of the people is really incredible. We went through the COVID pandemic. It didn't affect Africa as much as it affected some other regions of the world, but Africa has rebounded much stronger after this period. And I believe that the future holds a lot of potential for the continent in terms of the human resources and the material resources of the continent.
Professor Ubabukoh, there's one point about Africa that you hear more and more, that once upon a time it was exclusively focused on extractive industries, mainly minerals, extraction of minerals and their sale, and that was driving whatever revenues were being generated, whatever growth, which was creating all kinds of inequalities and friction on the continent, within societies and also between countries. But lately there is a talk that African economies are also diversifying and are moving away from this exclusive dependence on what's under the soil. So could you talk a little bit about what is happening there, and manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, fisheries, all kinds of and also other value-added sectors, I think, that seem to be boosting demand and all these things. So please tell our audiences, because there is a old time warped notion that Africa is nothing but extraction of minerals and the whole world is coming there and just trying to dig and steal the wealth and run away, but now it looks like Africa has got a lot more going and is diversifying.
Yes, this is absolutely true. Africa has a lot of things going for it at the moment, apart from just the extractive industries. We have a very huge startup sector for the technology. Young people are starting companies, doing amazing things in different areas. Agriculture is also a very big thing. And manufacturing as well. For a very long time, manufacturing in Africa had not been given as much attention. But now it's really kicking off. Manufacturing in Africa is becoming a very big deal. We are exporting now, even to the rest of the world. So we have a lot of things that we are doing well, we are doing right at the moment. Yeah.
Let me bring in Professor Yobo. Professor Yobo, you study conflicts on the continent, and of course the flip side to the economic dynamism and the expectations is the question of political stability and social harmony. And here, historically, both during the colonial period and the post-colonial period, Africa has suffered from a lot of these so-called internal wars or civil wars or ethnic conflicts and so on, right? And unfortunately, some of them, I can think of Somalia, I can think of the Democratic Republic of Congo, lately Sudan, and also Ethiopia, and also the Sahel region, which is close to Nigeria, from where you belong to. These 4 or 5 hotspots, have been recurring, and you have been studying these conflicts as well. So let's talk a little bit about this aspect and to what extent that impacts on the growth and the economic rise is also something that needs to, because there's always a political economy, right? It's not just purely economy. And on that front, often people say that Africa has huge problems. So could you reflect a little bit on these problems and their prospects, why they are so recurring and so long term, and some of these are protracted conflicts, and what can be done to move past this cycle of instability and volatility and violence?
Thank you very much. That is an equally important question when you are looking at Africa in terms of stability and, on one hand, economy. The stability of the African continent itself has been a product of the elite class. The political leadership of Africa tend to run these institutions they are managing from a very exclusive perspective. This has led to quite a number of other factions feeling excluded and feeling the need for some form of inclusion where different voices and perspectives could be added to bring about social change and social cohesion. These are lacking at the moment. Although the African population, the larger population of the African continent, are very resilient and are determined to hold the continent up and keep the flag flying. That has contributed significantly as to why Africa has not fallen apart. Because the people themselves are African. They see themselves as one first before the political divisions come in. So in spite of the political differences, in spite of the exclusive tendencies by the elite, the mass of the population are strongly behind the unity of Africa, believing that change can be ushered in through the people. And if you look at what happened in South Africa, for example, during the post-apartheid regime, it was the spirit of unity, the spirit of Ubuntu that held the country to a point of reconciliation, a point of truth-telling, where instead of saying, okay, the regime, the apartheid regime did X, Y, Z, therefore now the black South African are in turn and would therefore go against them, it was not that case. Rather, they held on to the spirit of Ubuntu. They say, what affects you affects me. So therefore, why should I take up arms against you or be embittered with you. Instead, let's tell ourselves the truth in our face and move on. This is the spirit that has been keeping Africa. If you also look at post-Rwanda genocide,
yes,
and you look at the Gacaca courts, you will look at the Gacaca court employed a spirit of unity as well. They also dwelled on the spirit of oneness. What affects one affects all. But beyond that, they looked at, instead of letting this wipe us away, instead of letting this leave only history for us, why don't we come together and sit down and reason, address these issues by ourselves, find the African solutions to the African problems, and overcome whatever has separated us so that we could move forward.
Yes, there is the tradition of the palaver, where people come together and resolve local problems at the grassroots level in so many parts of Africa. And yes, Rwanda, South Africa, two classic examples that have gone through a lot of trauma and suffering but have now stabilized. Indeed, they are inspirations to the world. Let me, on the question of unity, also bring in Professor Ubabukoh. Integration under the umbrella of the African Union is, I think, the foremost project for the continent. If you see, I mean, it's the dream of the Pan-Africanists, and they have been advocating for this oneness that Professor Yobo was also talking about, that culturally Africans are one people. And despite all the nation states, now we have 54 nation states on the continent, but then at the end of it, it's one big entity that's historically been connected through trade, through culture, through other forms of exchange, right? So there, please tell our audiences about the efforts to integrate the continent. The AU has been championing this the free trade agreement for the whole continent, to bring the whole continent together. It's a very ambitious agenda. And how is that going, and what more kinds of barriers between countries need to be broken down for Africa to realize the full economic potential?
Yes, thank you. Africa has been making efforts in moving towards the direction of African unity, towards Pan-Africanism. All the African nation states all have different individual interests. But I think what the African Union has been trying to do is to try to find common goals, common objectives that everybody can buy into and can make progress together in. The African Continental Free Trade Area is one good example. You have 55 countries. You have a combined GDP of about $3.5 trillion, a huge market. But now this market has been fragmented. It has not been able to pull its weight as one unit. But now with this agreement coming through, Africa will be able to create this single market where they can have interactions with the rest of the world with one voice. So far, the agreement has started yielding some fruits, even though it could be much better, even though all the different countries can adopt this agreement in a more holistic manner. But we can see from the projections that it can actually be very, very, very important. Also, the African Union has the Focused 2063 that they have been talking about. This is an ambitious goal that all of Africa is trying to achieve. I think this is also a good step in the right direction. I think we are trying to improve all aspects of the African continent. Our people, our education, our economies, our trade, all aspects. And I believe that in the future, these things will yield much greater dividends.
Professor Ubabukoh, there's also these sub-regional groupings. So one, there's the umbrella of the African Union, but different corners of Africa, they're also smaller. For example, there's the East African community, there's the SADC, the Southern African community, there's the ECOWAS in your region with Nigeria as the leader, and so on. So what is the importance of those sub-regional unity mechanisms, and how successful have they been in being able to pool together the resources and remove the barriers to free movement of people and trade, and so that the wealth creation can be enhanced?
Yes, these regional bodies in some way have been a barrier to African unity as a whole, but in many other ways, these regional collectives are also important because they serve a very important role in for example, politics. There was an intervention that ECOWAS had to do when the president of Senegal refused to step down for a while. They intervened in that situation.
Yes.
Different parts of the continent have peculiar challenges as well. So these regional bodies play a very major important role in terms of solving some of those issues. I believe that there needs to be a coming together of these regional bodies as well in terms of thinking about what they can do for the African continent to be one body. There has to be some integration of the ideas of these different regional bodies. But in terms of their individual impacts, they've all been very important. They're all doing very important things in the economy and in the politics of the individual regions as well.
Right. Professor Yobo, just taking off from there, the interventions of the AU or of the regional organizations is very critical, isn't it, for peace and security on the continent? I was just reading about the African Union's mediation efforts to stop the war in Ethiopia, you know, over Tigray, the Tigray region. I mean, that had become another like very sore spot on the continent and was hugely troubling. But luckily, they have intervened, they have mediated, and they have been able to bring the two sides to some kind of a truce or a ceasefire and ending hostilities. And we would hope that this would hold. So please talk a little bit about the role of these broader regional institutions and how they can also secure peace.
Thank you very much. So one of the issues, or some of the issues that we can be looking at from this perspective, is that there is that need for the African leadership to embrace some form of inclusive governance. A situation where the communities are brought together, the diverse communities are brought together to buy into what the leadership is providing is critical, is key. Community engagement builds that trust of the people, builds that trust, because look, this issue shouldn't be that leader A has the answer to it and it ends there. But the communities that are being directly affected should be brought on board. The diverse other groups such as the religious and the cultural and ethnic groups should also be brought in. Then we try to look at what kind of institutional capacities do they have, strengthen such institutions and make them functional and not just be respective of certain group of people. Because in some instances you see individuals become more powerful than the institutions. So we have to build and strengthen institutional capacities to be able to address certain peculiarities, certain issues that are directly affecting the people and the continent. These are issues and more that the leadership of the African Union, the African political elite could be looking into. Additionally, create some avenue for economic development where the wealth, the common wealth of the African people could be spread across different groups, because when it comes to wealth generation and with wealth distribution, sometimes there is this resentment amongst the people. The
inequalities,
the inequality, the injustices that are being perpetrated through the institutions that are designed to serve us. People do not see them serving as such. They do not see the transparency. They are seeing people being stronger than their collective whole or the institutions that are supposed to serve them. So addressing some of these issues and more could help the African Union or the African leadership to address the general and bigger problem that confronts it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, very important that there is a top-down and also a bottom-up, and that both these processes work in tandem to secure Africa. Professor Ubabukoh, there is also the question of religious extremism and terrorism, and these have unfortunately also appeared on the horizon. And in the case of, for example, in your own country, we have the Boko Haram, there is the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and so many other, even in Mozambique, down south, there are some of these Islamist attacks and groups that have come up. And this is somewhat relatively new because, historically, much of these so-called conflicts were treated as inter-ethnic, as in like so-called tribes against other tribes. That was how it was being portrayed as. But now you have this global, religious fundamentalism. All of they are linked to ISIS or Al Qaeda and all these, and this has also become a menace. The AU peace and stability, they have said that it is linked to the economic, issues also, because the insecurity caused by these groups can also affect the business and the trust that is necessary for commerce and for trade, right? So, could you talk a bit, especially in your country and the neighborhood, and in the Sahel region, there are all these so-called Islamist terrorist groups now. Initially, we thought that they were just creations of some small vested interest groups, but now they become quite rampant in the region. So, how important is stabilizing the continent from that point of view, so that the economy can move forward? And what is the role of the business community here? I mean, they should also be proactively trying to do something about this. You can't leave everything to the governments or to the African Union, right?
Yes, of course. It is extremely important to stabilize these regions. The terrorists are a big menace to the economy. When they are there, the farmers can't go to the farms to grow crops. Business people can't do their business. People can't travel freely. So it's a big issue. Actually, for example, in Nigeria, the current crisis with inflation that is going on there, a big part of that has to do with the fact that people are not able to do their business as they would normally do because of insecurity. I believe that countries have to take this problem a lot more seriously. These groups are, as you mentioned, they are internationally connected, they are very well funded, and they are very well motivated to keep doing what they are doing. And to bring a counterbalance, there has to be an equally well motivated force coming against them. So in addition to the national governments, the business community of course also has a part to play. They have to do their own due diligence in terms of taking care of the areas where they are responsible for. They have to put their own funds, their own resources in getting these problems resolved. But I think it's absolutely vital that the problem has to be resolved as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Now coming to the foreign players, I mean, so far we have spoken about the dynamics on the continent. Professor Yobo, India, now there's a lot of focus on what the Western powers have done in Africa historically, the colonization, the post-colonial interventions, the military, the so-called humanitarian interventions, many of which backfired, like in Libya. Then there is the Chinese presence. A lot has been talked about what China has done in terms of the loans, the debt, the infrastructure, and all those things, through its Belt and Road. But let's come to India now. We are in India. You're teaching in India as African scholars. What is your observation about India and so far what it has done?
India is one of the biggest players in Nigeria and in Africa. If you are looking at, in terms of humanitarian interventions, which you have said, you look at issues of food aid in some countries in Africa. You look at medical aid also coming in from India. But then much more than that, you also look at issues like disaster relief coming out of India and development, especially when you look at post-Rwanda. Again, we'll revisit Rwanda, post-Rwanda genocide, when India came through not just with food aid, not just with medical aid, but with sustainable infrastructural development to help this country recover from post-genocide, post-conflict effect it had on it. So India is coming, it's not just coming with the debt, as you have mentioned in the case of other powers, but it's also coming with some form of investment. So you look at such in the health, especially in the health sector, and especially when you look at also the issue of information technology, where you see the fintechs springing up, you see mobile telecommunications coming up and having that links and bilateral relations with India. I mean, it's a strong force coming. And between India and African Union, these are two powers that you need to watch.
Absolutely. So there's so many gaps that India is filling. Last word, Professor Ubabukoh. trade and investment, India is now, almost at 2023, we reached almost $100 billion of trade with the continent as a whole. Now, with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, we have hopes of expanding the bilateral trade and the investment links. And like you said, it's a 3.1 trillion approximately economy, the continent as a whole, 1.5 billion people is a huge market, and consumption is rising, the middle class in Africa is rising, and India does not want to be left behind, and Indian companies are seeing huge profits in Africa. And it is really, I mean, after the European Union, US and China, Africa as a whole is now our fourth biggest trading partner, so it's not a small a player by any means from our side. So what do you think needs to be done, last word on to promote the economic linkages between India and Africa?
Yes, as you said correctly, India-Africa trade has been escalating. In the year 2000, it was only about $8 billion in trade, but now it's getting over 100 billion. So it's a really huge partnership, and this partnership is projected to grow even much further. From my research, I've been able to see that by 2028, we can add almost 30 billion to the amount of trade that is going on between Africa and India. And well, I think also the business community, the business community in India, they have a huge role to play in terms of making partnerships and making joint ventures with African companies. Especially now that the African Continental Free Trade Area is being implemented, it will be even more important to make this kind of linkages where Indian businesses collaborate with African-based businesses to be able to create some joint venture or some kind of enterprise that will be able to create impact for both parties. Also, apart from just the purely business angle, we also have the social investments. For example, the Barefoot College that is bringing a lot of solar solutions and educational solutions. Yes. And all these kind of social investments, I think, are also very important for the relationship between India and Africa. And I believe in the next few years coming, this relationship will blossom far greater than any of us has ever expected that it will be.
Great. So viewers, the sum of this discussion with our two experts on African economics and politics is that India-Africa relationship is on the upswing. India can do a lot more for the continent, but already the levels of the relationship are quite high compared to even 10 years ago. So if we steadily build up with more innovative and enterprising ideas that link the private sectors of the two sides, that's also going to matter. India should also do more for peace and stability on the continent, perhaps also with peacemaking interventions. And more importantly, the African continent as a whole is on the rise. Africa with its young people and its boundless energy has not even fully tapped its potential. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that our goal is not to constrain the future of Africa, but to liberate its potential. This he said in 2018 in what were called the Kampala principles of India's engagement to Africa. Do look up the Kampala principles, because many of the points we've discussed with Professor Rita Lorbo and Professor Chisom Ubabukoh touch upon some of those principles, because our approach is to support the African Union to strengthen the continental unity and to make sure that the two-way interactions are beneficial for both sides and not exploitative. Let me thank our two guests for joining me. Thank you so much for being on Indian Diplomacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There is a place for hope on this planet called Africa. Let's all follow, cheer and support it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.